How could only 300 Spartans, led by King Leonidas, dare to defy the vast Persian Empire, an empire that marched with hundreds of thousands of soldiers? Why did Thermopylae, the hot gates, become the blood-soaked battlefield where courage clashed with tyranny, and where the roar of warriors shook the mountains? And how did the Greek phalanx, that unbreakable wall of shields and spears, shatter Xerxes' pride by defeating the so-called Immortals? 10,000 of his finest soldiers, whose very name promised eternity, yet who fell lifeless upon the stones. To understand this stand, we must journey back to the beginning, to the rise of Persia, the scars of Marathon, and the storm that gathered on the horizon. In the early 5th century before Christ, the Persian Empire stood as the greatest power the world had ever seen. Its borders stretched from the banks of the Indus River, through the deserts of Mesopotamia, across the mountains of Anatolia, and into the lands of Egypt. At its heart sat the mighty King Xerxes I, heir to Darius the Great, ruling with a hand that claimed to hold dominion over all men beneath the sky. Yet 10 years before, a humiliation had scarred the empire. At Marathon, a single Greek city-state, Athens, had thrown back the Persian tide. Against overwhelming odds, they had stood firm, broken the invaders, and sent them fleeing back to their ships. For Xerxes, the defeat was intolerable. It was not merely a military setback, it was an insult to his father's memory, a wound upon the pride of Persia, and so he vowed revenge. This was no ordinary campaign. Xerxes gathered a host unlike anything the world had witnessed. Ancient chroniclers claimed that over 1 million soldiers marched west. Modern historians believe the number was closer to 200,000, but still it was a force of near unimaginable size. His army boasted cavalry that could ride down any foe, archers whose arrows could darken the sun, and vast infantry drawn from every corner of the empire: Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, and more. With them came engineers who could bridge rivers and fleets of warships that turned the Aegean into a Persian lake. It was not just an army, it was a moving nation, marching west to crush a small, divided land. And that land was Greece. But Greece was no empire. It was a patchwork of proud, quarrelsome city-states, each jealous of its independence, each suspicious of its neighbor. Athens possessed a navy, swift and deadly, but her hoplites were few compared to Persia's endless ranks. Sparta commanded the finest infantry in the known world. Warriors bred from birth to fight, endure, and die without fear. Yet Sparta distrusted Athenian ambition, and Athens despised Spartan arrogance. To stand against Persia, they would need unity. But unity came only in the face of annihilation. And annihilation was exactly what Xerxes promised. He demanded submission, earth and water as tokens of surrender. Some cities bowed, others hesitated, but Sparta and Athens refused. To them, better to die free than to live as slaves. Still, the question remained, how could a handful of Greek states stand against such overwhelming might? On open plains, Persian cavalry would tear them apart. Under open skies, the rain of arrows would blot out the sun. The Greeks needed a place where numbers no longer mattered, a place where a few could stand against many. That place was Thermopylae, the hot gates, a narrow pass between mountain and sea, so constricted that only a handful of men could fight side by side. Here the Persians' vast numbers would count for nothing. Here courage and discipline might hold back the flood. And so it was decided. King Leonidas of Sparta, bound by duty to his laws and to his people, marched north with 300 chosen warriors, his royal guard. They were not simply soldiers. They were the embodiment of Sparta's way of life. Men hardened since childhood in the Agage, trained to fight as one unbreakable wall of bronze and iron. With them came allies from other Greek states, Thespians, Thebans, and more, swelling their ranks to roughly 7,000. Against them, hundreds of thousands. Against their bronze shields and long spears, waves of archers, cavalry, infantry armed with wicker shields and short spears. Against their discipline, sheer numbers. Yet while the Persians marched for conquest, the Greeks stood for survival. And survival, when cornered, can be more powerful than any empire. Xerxes was not a man who traveled lightly. When he marched, the world shook. His army was not merely soldiers, it was the sum of an empire. Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, Phoenicians, and countless others, all pressed into service under the banner of the great king. Some wore scale armor and carried spears. Others bore wicker shields, short bows, or curved swords. Together, they formed a tapestry of nations, unified not by loyalty, but by fear. At their heart were the Immortals, 10,000 elite Persian warriors, the king's own guard. Clad in fine armor, disciplined and deadly, they were a symbol of Persia's might. To the Greeks, they seemed unstoppable, an endless wave that would drown all resistance. And with the army came the fleet. Over 1,000 warships, triremes, and great transports escorted the march along the coast. They carried supplies, cavalry, engineers, siege weapons, an arsenal vast enough to break any city that dared to resist. Xerxes did not come to negotiate, he came to conquer. Yet beneath the grandeur lay weaknesses. Persia's strength was in numbers, but its army was a mosaic, stitched together from conquered peoples. Many fought because they must, not because they wished. Their weapons varied, some crude, some fine, and their loyalty was fragile. Against a disciplined enemy, those seams might split apart. The Greeks, by contrast, were few, but every man in their ranks had chosen to stand. The Spartan hoplite carried a bronze shield nearly 3 feet wide, a long spear of ash wood tipped with iron, and a short sword for close quarters. They fought in the phalanx, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, a wall of bronze that moved as one. It was not numbers that made them strong. It was unity, discipline, and the knowledge that retreat was not an option. As Xerxes' host crossed the Hellespont on pontoon bridges of ships bound with rope and timber, the scale of his ambition became clear. Rivers were drained to water his men. Fields were stripped bare to feed them. Wherever he marched, the land groaned under the weight of empire. To the Greeks, this was no longer a campaign. It was a storm rolling westward, one that threatened to wipe their very culture from the earth. And so, as the shadow of Persia advanced, the Greeks prepared to make their stand at Thermopylae, a narrow pass chosen not because it promised victory, but because it offered one thing only: time. Time for the Greek fleet to strike at sea. Time for their cities to prepare for the fire that was coming. At Thermopylae, a handful of men would be asked to hold back the greatest empire the world had ever known. Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a passage no wider than a modern road, hemmed in by sheer cliffs on one side and the sea on the other. It was here in the summer of 480 BC that the flood of Persia smashed into the rock of Greece. At dawn, Xerxes unleashed his first assault. 10,000 Persians, roaring in dozens of tongues, surged into the pass. Archers loosed clouds of arrows that blotted the sky. The earth shook beneath the march of infantry. Yet when they struck the Spartan line, they broke like waves against stone. Leonidas and his 300 stood at the center, bronze shields locked edge to edge, spears leveled in deadly points. The phalanx was more than a wall. It was a machine of flesh and bronze, each man bound to the other, unyielding, immovable. The first Persian ranks collided, their wicker shields splintering, their short spears shattering. They fell in heaps, cut down by long Greek lances before their blades could even reach the Spartan line. Herodotus writes that the ground was soon littered with bodies. Hundreds fell in the first assault alone. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne upon the cliffs, expected the Spartans to be swept aside. Instead, he saw his best troops, thousands of them, slain at the gates. Furious, he sent in more. Wave after wave, 20,000, 30,000 men. They rushed the pass, shouting, hurling spears, slashing with curved swords. The noise was deafening, the air choked with dust and screams. But still, the Greeks held. Their discipline was iron, their line unbroken. When spears snapped, they drew swords. When swords broke, they fought with fists, with teeth, with the sheer will not to yield. By midday, the pass was a furnace of death. Piles of corpses rose so high that men stumbled over the dead as they fought. Blood ran between the rocks like a red stream. The Persians dragged away their fallen by the hundreds, only to see the ground covered with more of their dead minutes later. Some accounts claim that as many as 10,000 Persians died in that first day, for the loss of only a few dozen Greeks. Xerxes, enraged, turned to his elite, the Immortals. 10,000 of the empire's finest advanced in gleaming ranks, their reputation unmatched, their name itself a boast of eternal might. With precision, they charged into the pass. But Leonidas was ready. He ordered a feigned retreat, drawing the Immortals deeper into the narrowest point of the pass. There, where their numbers counted for nothing, the Spartans wheeled and struck. Shields slammed forward with bone-crushing force. Spears punched through armor and flesh. The Immortals fell in their hundreds, their so-called immortality mocked by the piles of their dead. The battle raged until the sun set in blood-red haze. The earth shook with the clash of bronze and iron. The air rang with war cries and death screams. By nightfall, the hot gates were a charnel house. Thousands of Persians lay dead, their bodies heaped upon one another, the ground slick with gore. The Greeks had held. Against tens of thousands, they had lost only a fraction of their number. On the second day, Xerxes sent even more. Cavalry thundered at the flanks. Archers rained death from above. Infantry hurled themselves against the wall of bronze. Still the phalanx endured. Still the shields locked tight. The spears struck true. The pass became a slaughterhouse, each hour claiming thousands more Persian lives. For 2 days, Thermopylae was hell itself. But for the Spartans, for their allies, it was glory. Before the eyes of the world, a few thousand men had carved their defiance into history, standing unbroken against the greatest empire ever known. For 2 days, the Spartans and their allies had done the impossible. Tens of thousands of Persians lay dead before the hot gates. The pass was clogged with corpses, the sea stained with blood. Xerxes' pride had been shattered, yet the Greeks still held, unbroken, unyielding. But then came betrayal. A man named Ephialtes, a Greek from Malis, sought reward from the Persians. He revealed to Xerxes a hidden path, a goat trail winding through the mountains, a way to outflank the defenders. Guided by Ephialtes, Persian troops marched under cover of night. By dawn, they stood above the pass, ready to descend on the Greeks from behind. When word reached Leonidas, he knew the end had come. The hot gates would be lost. Retreat was possible for some, but not for all. And so he made a choice that would echo through history. He dismissed most of the allies, sending them home to fight another day. With him remained his 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians who refused to leave, and a small band of Thebans. Barely 1,000 men standing against an empire. The morning of the third day dawned blood red. Xerxes unleashed his full might. Tens of thousands surged into the pass from the front, while others swept down from the rear. The Greeks were surrounded. The sky blackened with arrows. The ground thundered with cavalry. The clash of bronze and iron shook the mountains. Leonidas fought at the front, his spear thrusting, his sword slashing, his shield battering men aside. Around him, Spartans fell one by one, each taking dozens of Persians with them. The Thespians, unflinching, fought to the death beside their allies. The air was a storm of dust, blood, and screams. The Persian dead rose in mounds, their bodies piled so high that soldiers climbed over their fallen comrades just to reach the Spartan line. But the Greeks were dying too. Their spears shattered, their swords dulled. They fought with daggers, with broken blades, with bare hands. Still they fought. Herodotus tells us that Leonidas himself fell in the thick of battle, struck down by Persian spears. The Spartans fought desperately to recover his body, 3 times driving back the enemy before they too were cut down. Around his corpse, the last Spartans formed a circle, fighting to the end, refusing to yield even as death closed in. By the time the final Spartan fell, the pass was choked with the dead. Some say 20,000 Persians perished at Thermopylae, their blood soaking the stones. The Greeks, all but a handful, lay slain. Yet in their death they had bought what they sought: time. The stand of Leonidas and his 300 became immortal. Not because they won, for they did not, but because they chose to die, willingly in defiance of impossible odds. Their sacrifice gave Greece the chance to fight on, to rally, to strike at Salamis and Plataea. And in doing so, they carved into history a truth no empire could erase: that freedom, defended with courage, can outlive even death. When the dust settled at Thermopylae, the air was thick with smoke and the stench of death. The narrow pass, once just a strip of land between mountain and sea, had become a graveyard. The bodies of 20,000 Persians lay heaped upon one another, rotting under the sun. Among them, nearly every Greek defender had fallen: Spartans, Thespians, Thebans, all dead but unbroken. Xerxes had won the field, but not the victory he desired. He had expected Thermopylae to fall in a single day. Instead, 3 days of relentless battle had cost him tens of thousands of lives, including his most elite troops. He had seen his immortals cut down. He had watched wave after wave of his soldiers die before the spears of a few thousand Greeks. The hot gates had become a furnace that consumed men like fire consumes dry wood. For Greece, the loss was bitter. Leonidas was dead. His 300 were gone. Yet the story of their stand spread like wildfire. Messengers carried the tale to every city, to every farm, to every heart in Greece. The people heard how 1,000 men had held back an empire, how free men had chosen death over slavery. In Sparta, grief mixed with pride. Mothers who had lost sons stood tall, knowing their children had died as true Spartans. In Athens, citizens swore that the sacrifice would not be in vain. Across Greece, the tale of Thermopylae became a rallying cry. No longer was Persia an unstoppable giant. It could be resisted. It could be bled. And for Xerxes, the road to Greece was now open, but it was stained with the blood of his own men. He marched south, his army vast but weary, his pride shaken. He would burn Athens, yes. He would take cities. But the shadow of Thermopylae marched with him. The memory of 1,000 men who had stood against an empire haunted every step. At the hot gates, a stone was raised. Upon it was carved an epitaph that would echo through eternity. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." These words became more than a memorial. They were a message to the world that freedom has a price, that courage can defy even the mightiest empire, and that sacrifice can turn defeat into immortality. Though Thermopylae ended in blood and fire, its legacy endured far beyond the battlefield. In death, Leonidas and his men achieved what few in history ever could. They gave Greece time for its cities to rally, time for its fleet to prepare, time for its people to find unity in the face of annihilation. Only weeks later, at Salamis, the Greek navy struck a shattering blow, luring the Persian fleet into narrow waters and destroying it. A year later, at Plataea, the united Greek armies drove Xerxes' forces back across the sea. Persia's dream of conquering Greece died on those fields, and in its place rose a new idea: that free men, bound together, could defy empire. Thermopylae became more than a battle. It became a symbol. To the Greeks, it was proof that courage could overcome fear, that discipline could withstand chaos, that sacrifice could outlive death. To the world, it was a reminder that freedom is not given, but earned, and kept only by the blood of those willing to defend it. For centuries, poets, historians, and leaders would return to the hot gates. Herodotus wrote of it. Simonides immortalized it in verse. Generals in Rome, in Europe, even in modern times, would hold Thermopylae as the measure of honor and courage. When facing overwhelming odds, When confronted with despair, men would remember the 300. Today, Thermopylae still speaks to us. It speaks of sacrifice without hope of survival. It speaks of men who chose death not for themselves, but for generations unborn. It speaks of the eternal truth that freedom, once kindled, cannot be extinguished, not by numbers, not by empire, not even by death itself. And so, as long as stories are told, the hot gates will remain open in memory, a place where courage stood against fear, where 1,000 men defied an empire, and where 300 Spartans led by their king marched into legend.